Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode, I think, 8 of the Citrix session. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside, and I have several people with me today that I'm excited about. Bill Sutton, of course. Bill, how's it going?
It's going well, Andy. How about yourself?
It's good. Yeah, Bill's our Director of Services at XenTegra and a longtime Citrix guy, and one of the places I go when I need to talk shop. With Bill, we also have the XenTegra CTO for the first time, Pete Downing. Hey, Pete, how's it going?
Hey, Andy, what's going on, man?
Yeah, we're glad to have you on and get your insight into some of this. And, Pete runs around the country, including Canada, and a lot online, and does a lot of classes teaching Citrix and Microsoft and how they come together both in a cloud world and a hybrid world. And Pete probably knows as much of this as probably anybody on the planet. But we also have with us one of the Citrix lead architects, Kevin Nardone, who I've known for a long time. How's it going, Kevin?
Andy, thanks for having me. Great to be on.
So, Kevin, I don't know exactly how we met, but it had a lot to do with a little product called AppDNA back in the day, right?
Yeah, I remember we did like a road show between Charlotte, Atlanta, Raleigh, and then I think we ended up going back to Charlotte. There was something in there where we were crossing the Carolinas and Georgia a couple times, but it was a lot of fun. I think almost 6 or 7 years ago at this time, so time's definitely flown by. And now I'm the lead architect role. I think it's my 5th role at Citrix since then. So, but it's been fun.
I think it had something to do with going from Charlotte to Atlanta. No, Charlotte to Atlanta to Raleigh, or Charlotte to Raleigh to Atlanta. But whatever it was, whoever planned that didn't think about logistics too well. So, and it's funny we bring up AppDNA, right? That's one of many Citrix acquisitions that is still applicable today, right? I mean, do you see nearly enough people taking advantage of AppDNA as you did in the past? Or ever?
Not as much. I wish more people would, because especially, as we kind of get into some of the topics today around Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop, a big component of that is Windows 7 extended security updates on Azure, as well as, outside of that from a server perspective, 2008 R2 extended security updates. So Microsoft is rolling out 2 major extended support programs just because customers are still having a hard time getting off of some legacy application. Yep. So especially, when it comes to apps, it's still really just that knowledge capital tends to always be one of the main barriers. And then another piece is always just time, especially in, critical industries like healthcare, where change windows are very expensive and very complicated. Upgrading apps tends to fall down the wayside until it's more of a fire drill.
So, Kevin, you're saying actually understanding your applications, first of all, which ones they are, and understanding how they work still applies, whether it's in the cloud or not. That's crazy talk.
Exactly. And yeah, I'm sure as we kind of dig into the topics today, and especially when we go through, why Citrix and Microsoft, one of the biggest things really is hybrid cloud. I think as much as, Google or Microsoft or Amazon really push cloud. What we're really seeing, especially on the Citrix side, being that presentation layer, is that, the real world is going to be hybridized. There are going to be apps that can't get forklift to the cloud because of database constraints. Going through like a Windows operating system upgrade, for example, from like a 7 to 10, there's all a complexity around that migration, but a lot of other types of migrations that become more applicable to cloud are app refactoring. So going from like an infrastructure as a service model, say, for example, with like a SQL server that's providing a backend for an app published via Citrix, moving that to the cloud, for example, and refactoring that application to use maybe more of a platform as a service model, like the Azure SQL service. That's its own fair share of migration, and tends to also limit what is going to stay on-prem versus, the actual front end being run in Citrix via the cloud. I mean, a great example of that is, what Citrix is going through right now. We're taking a lot of our technology that was always an on-prem form factor, and then through, the development and growth of Citrix Cloud over the last couple of years, I mean, we're refactoring our applications and our software to be more cloud friendly. So looking at, even just what we're transforming within Citrix, most customers, when they start thinking of the cloud, those back-end application teams for web or databases are going through a similar migration process as, a 7 to a 10 or a 2008 R2 to a 2016. So it's interesting. And I think really as we kind of dig into some of this today and just the advantages of being hybrid, especially when you get into things like cost control and leverage, it really kind of goes a long way. And it's thinking that way is what most customers that are successful when they go to the cloud, having that expectation in mind I've seen drive a higher degree of success.
Yeah. So without a doubt, the applications still matter. And honestly, when you start this journey, whether it's cloud or not cloud or hybrid, understanding those applications is huge. I made a joking reference just now to even know what application you have. You'd be shocked how many customers go into a application or desktop virtualization project and don't know what apps they have that they've got to now figure out how to design around. But so let me kind of set the stage here. So this is not based on a blog. This is based on a webinar that you did a couple weeks ago with Microsoft, and you guys had this really interesting slide up on the screen where you went through the value adds of adding Citrix to a Microsoft WVD world, and I'll take a minute to point out that WVD is often misused. It's Microsoft's implementation of a brokering service to Windows 10 single session and multi-session, and even Windows 7 in Azure. But really, what we're talking here is an Azure hosted desktop that you have entitlements to under your Microsoft licensing, like an M365 license. But really what we're talking about here is going through what Citrix brings to that story that you don't know that you will probably need, because those 30 years of Citrix development, just because we move it to the cloud on a product that Microsoft is now marketing, those challenges don't go away, and you're going to need the beauty of what Citrix has been bringing to this industry for a long time. Let me ask real quick, Bill Sutton, you know what we're covering today. Any specific things you want to make sure Kevin covers as part of this conversation?
Well, the key thing for me is really what does it look like from a setup standpoint? How seamless and easy is it to set up? What does the customer require? As well as a lot of the things that were in that webinar that Kevin did around the items that you have up on the screen that we're looking at, which are about extending the value of Citrix, extending the value of Windows Virtual Desktop. A lot of topics here I think we're going to cover, and a lot of those are very, very relevant to the world today.
Would you agree with this statement that most customers are not going to succeed with WVD without some third party product to make it more usable at this point?
In my view, based on what I've seen and experimenting with it, I think the answer to that's a resounding yes at this point.
Yeah. Hey, Pete Downey, what do you think about that comment?
I agree. And I think that there's a huge value on layering Citrix with WVD and just Azure in general. So I'm excited to kind of talk in and dig into some of these topics.
Anything that you want to make sure Kevin covers as he's going through these value add pieces of Citrix on top of Microsoft WVD?
I think the big thing is we need to convey that, hey, this is not a compete. This is complementary, and the value of Citrix is around the. I always say it's around the protocol and the access. So I think those are the two things that we should definitely hone in on.
So in a Microsoft world, in a customer world, the Citrix is going to win. The customer's going to win if you add the Citrix components to it. And if you can do it without Citrix or some other product, if you can do it without it, then great. But we probably realize that that's just not going to happen. And in many cases, there's ways to be upfront with educating people, which is what we're going to do here today. Let me say this one thing real quick, and then I'm going to hand over to Kevin. I keep calling it WVD. I'm falling in the same trap. What we're really talking about here is Microsoft Enterprise Virtual Desktop in Azure, and WVD is an example of that, just like Kleenex is an example of a tissue. Right, there's a product set, and then there's what everybody calls it. And what we want to really make sure we do is talk about it clearly and make sure people know that the Microsoft and Citrix story has a naming convention. There's pieces of that help what it really is. So let me just stop with that, my ramblings. And Kevin, you can straighten out everything we've said here and help educate us. I'm looking at the slide right now, and I'm just going to go around the horn with it. The very first thing that you guys have as a topic for helping Microsoft Enterprise Virtual Desktops be better with Citrix is the Citrix app layering technologies. Let's jump into that one first.
Definitely. So especially when, app layering, like anything that, even like App DNA, for example, like whenever you're doing something with the apps, it takes time, but that time that you put into the overall product, it drives just significant value for an organization. Where app layering really comes into play, especially is around, for example, hybridizing your image. So thinking of like what you're doing on premises today, you're working with, XenServer, Citrix Hypervisor, or another on-premises platform, different hypervisor tools that are built deeply into the image. Now, when you're going towards an Azure, those hypervisor tools need to change. So you're now effectively doubling your image count per use case. So, double your VDI images, double your server hosted images, especially if you want to get towards that hybrid cloud model, or even get into an area where if we have this image today, we want to seamlessly move it from cloud to cloud, for example. That's kind of where app layering really comes into play, especially when it comes to extending the value of Windows Virtual Desktop, is with that platform layer, being able to seamlessly transition your image from one hypervisor that's on-prem to Microsoft Azure. And then being able to manage that accordingly. I've one customer, for example, that they were driving a significant number of applications in the cloud. And, obviously, when demands change, pricing change, costs change, cost considerations change, they need to pull some workloads on-prem because they had a team that was refreshing a set of their hardware. So they're delivering a lot of apps and workloads via Azure. Hey, we need to, diversify. Let's have something that's running always on. We've seen cost benefits in Azure with more of a pay-as-you-go model versus reserved, where we want to shift this workload back to on-prem. For example, now they just threw a platform layer on for their on-premises hypervisor, pulled a couple servers on-prem, and then used cloud more for the burst because of the benefit of the pay-as-you-go model, for example. So they're able to dynamically move as a business because of the time investment they put into rebuilding their images using Citrix app layering.
So let's move on to the, excuse me there, Kevin. Let's move on. That's really, really solid. And I think that's definitely value add. So let's talk a little bit about the next topic here, which is advanced monitoring.
Sure. Yeah. And I can go around the horn. So thinking about advanced monitoring, a lot of that is really referring to Citrix Director. So the ability for, the session metrics in terms of like a level 1 help desk, being able to troubleshoot end user issues, being able to go into trend analysis and see, okay, what's the capacity, what apps are being used, what desktops are being used in my environment, what are the trends from a log on time perspective. Citrix Director, especially when you kind of look into, EdgeSite, et cetera, I think Andy kind of really captured something really well when it comes to like Windows Virtual Desktop being like a platform for brokering your sessions and getting access to these workloads within Azure. Well, Citrix, we've been investing in a platform for decades. And when it comes to using Citrix with, WVD, really it is an entitlement of Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. So thinking of advanced monitoring and kind of getting into integration with WVD, I think it makes sense to take a step back in terms of how Citrix integrates with Windows Virtual Desktop. So Citrix, we're still providing the brokering, session monitoring, policies and application of your delivery groups of who's who is getting these workloads. How we integrate with Windows Virtual Desktop is strictly through the VDA, using as a partner of Microsoft the entitlement to leverage Windows 10 multi-session from Azure. So like all of the monitoring capabilities, and especially if, for those who are listening or existing Citrix customers, the monitoring with Director, using Studio, none of that has to change when it comes to getting some of the benefits of taking your existing Windows entitlements and being able to use net new use cases of a multi-session client OS from Azure. So thinking of advanced monitoring, really that is Director. And the same goes with machine creation services, being able to provision your machines based on, how many VMs do we need on, like in Azure, let's change like the service offering, for example, if we have two different use cases that need different instance sizes, building off of layering, for example, you can have an on-premises provisioning services deployment and then shift to machine creation services in the cloud. Being able to automatically provision machines based on a single golden image, for example. But I guess Bill and team, is there any questions or comments or anything you want me to dig in further, or continue to just kind of walk through some of the benefits category by category?
So go ahead, Pete.
Oh, I was just going to say one of the benefits I think with Director is the point in time troubleshooting, right? So if you're a help desk user and you're supporting one of your end users, one of the things I love about Director is it gives you that ability to go in and get point in time. Hey, I got to search for Bill and he's having an issue. Well, I can go and shadow his desktop. I can go in and kill a process. So I think, that's a huge value. but it's also simple. Like the director is, I hate to say it, stupid easy to use. And when it's set up correctly, it just makes not only Citrix, but to your point, WVD easier to troubleshoot. So that's one of the things that excites me about that integration, is that it just makes help desk's job easier.
And I would completely agree with that, but I want to take one baby step back and make sure that I'm clear. Are you saying that with the integration with Microsoft or Windows Virtual Desktop, that Studio, I heard you say Studio and Director are still part of that ecosystem of management and monitoring, like they are of the CVAD, Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops offering today?
Yes.
Okay.
So a lot of the right now with like Windows Virtual Desktop proper, if you were just going straight Microsoft, all of that is strictly managed through the Azure portal. When you integrate with Citrix as a partner, we have that entitlement of allowing customers to use the Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. So that would really just be, I'm deploying a machine catalog. So I've gone into the Azure Marketplace or built my own Windows 10 multi-session image. I've added what's now dubbed since 1909, the multi-session VDA. So I now have the capability to deliver a workload that can have multiple user sessions connecting to it. So you would build that machine catalog with that multi-session entitlement enabled. You would then build that, and you'd provision those machines out with that machine creation services, and then publish them in a delivery group, just like you would today.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess what I'm probably taking a larger step back and make sure that I understand, because I think some of our listeners may be a little confused here. Are we talking about Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops linked to Windows Virtual Desktop, or are we talking about the Citrix Managed Desktop offering? Or both?
Great point of clarity. So like thinking of like what versions of Citrix can we use with Windows Virtual Desktop, you have like the services like you mentioned, with Citrix Virtual App and Desktop Service, which you can now get access with Workspace Premium Plus, or Citrix Virtual App and Desktop Service licensing. One of the big differences too, and before we kind of get into Managed Desktop, is thinking of the concept of multi-session. Citrix Virtual App Service has always been multiple user sessions within a server operating system. With multi-session Win 10 via Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop, you can actually now do the multi-session experience of Client OS from the Virtual App Service. So that's kind of an added benefit of like going in this direction with it when it comes to workloads on Azure. Now, Citrix Managed Desktop makes this a little bit different because
Kevin,
sorry, go for it.
Kevin, if possible, I'd like to avoid talking about CVAD or Citrix Managed CMD, Citrix Managed Desktop. I think we're just going to muddy the waters here, other than that's the completely managed desktop by Citrix. And yes, it includes the monitoring piece that we're talking about here as well, right?
Yeah, so the monitoring is a little, and we can kind of dig in. I think that's CMD is probably a topic for another webinar in itself, because the monitoring is actually a little bit different. It's not as robust as the full featured director. And I think as that continues being, especially like a version 1.0 offering from Citrix of like a DAS service, I feel like a lot of the customers in, the enterprise or commercial spaces, when you get into some of the granularity of, what they truly need as a business, DAS is going to be more still like a niche.
Well, that's why I'm asking to talk about it, because most of our listeners is not going to apply. We're just going to confuse them worse. Hey, I do have a question around the advanced monitoring. Does it have the ability to understand the Azure component here and get below the VM? Or are we still just stuck at the VM level when it comes to Director?
So within Director, it's still at the VM level. So like understanding within the VDA from like an Azure Monitor perspective, like integrating into Azure directly, a lot of that comes from security analytics. So like being able to hit the Azure Secure Graph API and get information on Azure Active Directory, identity events, like from an authentication perspective, if they're using Azure AD as an authentication provider, as well as Windows Defender, Advanced Threat Protection, being able to dig into those events that are being pushed out to like Azure Security Graph from a notification perspective. But when it comes into, I'm within Director and I need a notification because there's an Azure service issue, or I need to monitor like the API rights that are enabled that I have within my overall subscription because I'm powering on a ton of machines and I'm starting to get load throttled. Unfortunately, that information still exists strictly within the Azure portal.
So one of the challenges with Director has always been not being able to see under the covers at the hypervisor level. I would be shocked if we don't see in the next couple of years Citrix at least add Azure utilization into this console, because that's, they've always had the challenge, okay, which hypervisor are we going to add to that? But, adding the Azure information in under Director, which is some of the places, some of the other monitoring tools add value, that would be awesome if that happens at some point. Wouldn't you agree, Pete?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think there's a lot of great, tie-ins that can go back and forth. So yeah, I totally agree with that, Andy. So.
All right, Kevin, let's go to the next topic, machine creation services. Sounds very trivial, but it does have a very specific role in the world of Citrix, enabling Microsoft Enterprise Virtual Desktop on Azure.
Oh, definitely, especially when being, the single image management technology. And I think a lot of the flexibility is what drives some of the effectiveness, as well as like some of the ability to kind of control costs. So for example, from a flexibility perspective, I can take a snapshot, I can take a storage account VHD, I can take a managed disk, and I can create that base image, and I can deploy out, from that same image without having to do a handful of, JSON templates or to have deep familiarity with Azure, especially if you're an on-premises customer. I can provision that out with the parameters I'm looking for my use case. So that same master image I can turn into hundreds of desktops, or I can split that out. Say, for example, I have, base Office desktop, Office 365, Adobe, and I have users that are maybe more commodity. I want to keep costs low. Let's provision them out with, some general purpose instances with standard storage. And then I have maybe power users. Maybe they're VIPs, like directors or executives. I don't want to double my image, but I want to be able to take that same golden image and turn it into, a delivery group for VIPs. So I'm going to push that out to premium storage and give them, compute optimized instances, for example. And I think that power of the flexibility of provisioning, being able to take that same gold image, dynamically allocate it to different Azure instances types or storage types based on use case, is probably one of the most powerful pieces of, our investment in that provisioning technology. One of which that exists on-prem, same way that you manage workloads in Azure. If you're using MCS, you can do it on-prem as well, or provisioning services. Other cool capabilities that are very Citrix specific is the ability now to, especially within Azure, do like IO caching. So for example, I have, read intensive operations or, write intensive operations. Instead of, hitting say standard storage, I could actually offload some of those IOPS into memory. And then I can still have a non-persistent machine, but things like event logs, antivirus definitions, same as some of the use cases you'd see on-prem, I can actually have that cache disk persist so that users can, I can now keep those event logs and have a non-persistent VDI within Azure. So get some of that benefit of non-persistence from an administrative standpoint, but still have things cached like logs. So if I do have like historical issues that I need to kind of continuously improve and work towards, I'm not going to lose like critical logging data. And that was released with the 1903 version of Citrix Virtual App and Desktop.
Anytime this topic comes up, right, we talk about operational efficiencies like Kevin just talked about, which is 100% true. At the same time, if you put your security hat on for a minute, just knowing the fact that machines always reboot to a gold, clean, non-infected image, no matter what happens, ideally when the user logs off and it automatically reboots. So there's really two angles, right? There's the no-brainer operational thing Kevin talked about. At the same time, knowing that it's going to reboot back to a gold image, and that should be step number one in sleeping well at night, knowing these images can't be infected long term. Any things to add to the security side of that piece, Kevin?
Yeah, I would say the consistency, especially, hey, we know that like if anything occurred on this image, I can flush it out and go back to the basics. But I think also, supportability is pretty critical as well when it comes to that. That I know every user's desktop is coming from the same point in time, so that I'm not dealing from like a troubleshooting perspective, especially when you get into like persistent desktop scenarios, which you can also deploy with MCS, where like, hey, I've done something that's unique to me. Maybe it's something I introduced into the overall image because it's a persistent desktop. So even from like consistency from a security perspective, I know that all my versions, like, hey, there's a security flaw within this version, I need to patch it. I'm patching it in one place and pushing it out to a handful of desktops centrally, rather than having to apply that to each individual machine, and maybe increasing the length of time for you to address like a security issue, for example. So some of that centralization from a security perspective and maintaining version management and addressing security patching is very beneficial as well.
Yeah, I had an employee tell me he was not using a XenTegra virtual desktop, which they should be. Try to explain to me that Office was installed 3 times on his computer the other day, and I was like, I don't know if that's possible, but whatever it is, I don't trust it. Hey, we're fortunate here, and I don't want to go too far down this path, but we got Pete on, and Pete is the guy who brought Citrix Provisioning Services, which is another provisioning technology into the world of Citrix, which doesn't actually apply here. However, Pete knows a lot about provisioning. Hey, Pete, anything else you'd like to add to what Kevin and I have been talking about here around machine creation services that you see as a tremendous value add for Citrix in a Microsoft world?
So, first off, it just works. I mean, and we're going to talk about a couple other things in a little bit, things like auto scale, profile management. It eases the pain, but what Kevin's alluding to around machine creation services, the non-persisted scenario, I always tell people, when they go to cloud, you better have a good profile management, strategy, because going persisted, I personally think is not the way to go when you start looking at Azure or even WVD. I think machine creation services enables that. But there's some other cool stuff we're going to talk about in a couple seconds that will help augment this story. But yeah, one of the things I always tell people is machine creation services plus Azure just works.
Yeah, that's good, and that is one of the things that machine creation service in the very, very beginning, especially when some of the PVS guys first used it, didn't work perfectly, and a lot of people wrote it off then. But whether it's traditional, on-prem or in your private cloud or colo or in the Azure or even some of the other clouds at this point, it does just work, and it's super simple. And I tell people all the time that if I can help you with PVS, but I need like a week to train you. MCS, give me 15 minutes. A whiteboard, and you're going to be good to go. So, hey, Kevin, let's jump into the next topic you have on here, which is hybrid cloud. What are you covering there?
So, thinking of this, when it comes to Windows Virtual Desktop Standalone, and some of the topics that we kind of talked about earlier, Andy, around application migration. One of the major benefits of running Citrix with WVD is the ability to kind of still leverage your on-premises resources. So, say for example, you have a pretty aggressive, transition plan to put more workloads in Azure. Maybe you're rolling down a data center. There's going to be a point in time where end users are hitting resources in 2 locations. So what's the one thing you want to do when it comes to, trying to maintain productivity is you don't want to disrupt that flow where now to get my Azure apps, I have to go to one portal, and to get my on-premises apps, I have to go to another. So the hybridization of Citrix and being able to hybridize your workloads, of Azure on-prem to your on-premises hypervisor. I know within Ignite, they just announced the ability to kind of do like Azure Stack on-prem with WVD. But when it comes to like forklifting your on-premise infrastructure to another hypervisor, that's challenging as well. So even thinking of hybrid cloud outside of workloads, that flexibility of infrastructure, I can bring my own hypervisor and manage those workloads via Citrix, whether it be a public cloud hypervisor or on-prem. That's kind of where, when you think at just the macro level from a business perspective, and as people are looking to the cloud or even going multi-cloud and trying to have more leverage from one cloud provider like Microsoft to another. Hey, we're renegotiating our enterprise agreement. 100% of your business is on Azure. There's not a lot of leverage that you have in that scenario. So we see a lot of customers looking at Citrix as the ability to kind of build some of that leverage from an infrastructure perspective. That same use case I mentioned earlier around that customer who had to kind of pull some workloads on-prem to kind of manage costs, for example, or hey, our use case has changed. It's more cost efficient for us to run this on-prem. They also, leverage, other cloud providers for ability to kind of make spend more flexible. Hey, we've seen this new instance type, it's cheaper. Let's start provisioning workloads there, and kind of building off the other topics. We're going to throw in a platform layer for app layering. We're going to then spin up, use machine creation services to then spin up those machines because we've hybridized. So hybrid cloud there is no specific feature. It really is just a combination of all Citrix technologies, but it's really where we shine at a macro level when you think of, why Citrix is the ability to drive that flexibility from a business when it comes to being able to hybridize their workloads and move them in a way that allows them to drive better cost efficiency.
And that's really awesome, right? And I tell people all the time, if you want to do this thing right when it comes to a cloud world, bring in a couple different IaaS cloud providers. Could be your own. Like you keep a little bit back in your own little data center somewhere, so that you can have that have the efficiency and control your own destiny. At the same time, knowing that a lot of us, because of the awesome solution Microsoft has created in Azure, that's going to be your default. But it doesn't have to be your only one. And if you work with Citrix, you're going to enable yourself to have options.
Exactly. And kind of building off some of the topics as well, I think talking about performance and hybridization is also workspace environment management. I know with WVD, there's also the entitlement of FSLogix, which is, has a handful of benefits around Office 365 optimization from like a OneDrive or a cache exchange mode perspective. While you now have access to this new profile solution, what about UPM? Like, where does that go? Well, regardless of how you want to do the core user profile, workspace environment management kind of builds off of both of those solutions with the ability to, one, optimize resources. So thinking of like what we've been talking about, Andy, around cost and then being able to be flexible. There's also optimizing performance, which is something that can be done with workspace environment management or WEM, and then the ability to also do like user experience optimization around, hey, I want to apply registry keys or network drives or change printer settings based on end user filters or like properties, like where are they connecting from, what group are they connecting to. So building onto like GPOs. We want to shift some GPOs. Maybe the Citrix team can't manage that. They're losing the ability to control the experience. Being able to shift some of those common parameters into a centralized tool that can empower like the Citrix admin is also a major value add of Citrix on top of WVD's entitlement of FSLogix. And sorry if I interrupted you there for a second, Andy, but figured how that kind of ties into some of the hybridization, because that can also be run on-prem or in the cloud as well.
Well, to me, that was a great thing to see Microsoft acquire FSLogix, because what that did was it showed that they understood that the user experience and the user settings, having that an efficient, effective, simple way to bring that to the cloud, wherever the cloud is in that moment, in this case, Azure, showed that they really had put some thought into that next piece of the story and whether or not it was going to make sense. But what you're pointing out here again is that Citrix has a story and has had a story that's going to play really well in the cloud, whether the cloud is Azure or your private data center or a closet at the end of the hallway in a branch office. It's going to still play there and be part of the story. Hey, Bill, thoughts on the Workspace Environment Manager, WIM, piece of what Microsoft gets from working with Citrix?
Oh, absolutely. So, the ability to kind of reduce the reliance on GPOs. But I kind of want to go back to the hybrid cloud scenario, because I think an important thing that this provides that I think Kevin alluded to here earlier is the ability to leverage the private cloud in certain, the customer's data center, for the lack of, or another way of saying it, to leverage that for those apps that you mentioned earlier that have database requirements or certain on-premises requirements to be able to leverage the hybrid cloud nature of Citrix Cloud and the offering there that allows us to put some workloads in Azure, maybe some workloads in another cloud, maybe those workloads that have apps that need to be close to the user or close to the data in a private cloud. So having that flexibility is key.
No, great. I totally agree with that. And I want to go to the next topic now around autoscale, because here's the key in all this, right? It is a beautiful story, especially if you're moving workloads into Azure. However, if it costs a fortune, then that's going to be a challenge. So I think Kevin's going to talk now about autoscale and how autoscale can help mitigate the cost overruns that might happen as you move to the cloud. And Kevin, as you go through this, I know this is a topic near and dear to Pete. So at some point, we're going to let Pete jump in. So Pete, feel free to jump in directly on this topic. And if you have questions and want to kind of help Kevin expand on this one, this is the one. Go ahead, Kevin.
Perfect. Yeah. So autoscale, and now kind of building off of all these topics, especially with hybrid cloud, we've kind of talked cost. Now, especially when you go from like a public cloud model, it's one of the greatest benefits is, if I have a use case that's ephemeral, it's maybe 3 months in a year, it's, maybe or like a DR or something along those lines, taking advantage of those consumption and pay-as-you-go cost models, is a big impetus for a lot of customers even considering cloud, especially if you have like a seasonal workload. Well, Autoscale helps manage that cost, where you have a pay-as-you-go instance. This machine is up and running. It's on. I want to create schedule, maybe based on my Monday through Friday work week, peak times, off peak times, as well as load-based parameters to scale up my workloads or power on and to configure my workloads in a way to kind of meet that demand. So Autoscale, is a Citrix Cloud only feature, and it allows you to manage those parameters based on your use case or delivery group for your workloads. So I want to drive down my overall costs. I want to say, for example, and you can even kind of augment this in a way, especially if as like a customer, if you're going through the cloud journey already and hey, I'm going to reserve some of this capacity. I have some users that I know we're going to always be on. If I buy a year or 3 years up front of the specific instance, it's going to be more beneficial to my business. Now, how do you manage, those bursts that might push you into a pay-as-you-go model beyond your reservations? Autoscale does that very fantastically as well, because you could just set your schedule to be like default. Hey, I'm going to run 20% always on because I know I've reserved 20% of my capacity. Let's manage the bursts because we know that capacity can change, and we know that workloads can change in terms of need and utilization. Let's manage that risk by kind of creating automation behind it. So that's just some of the main benefits overall, but it is built into the overall Studio platform. It's built in the admin experience, and it manages those workloads accordingly. And I'm excited to see where we continue to take Autoscale. I feel like we've really just scratched the surface on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things I love about the Autoscale, especially with Azure in general, is the fact that when it powers off a VM, it doesn't just power it off. It also deallocates the virtual machine. It also deallocates the storage associated with it. So to your point, it's minimizing the cost, which is a huge benefit to coupling, and machine creation services with Autoscale. So I always tell my customers, to say, hey, when you say, hey, I need 100 virtual machines, do you really need 100 virtual machines 24/7? Probably not. And that's the benefit of taking, machine creation services, coupling with the Autoscale feature. And I'm like you, I'm excited to see how this will evolve even more, because you can do a lot of cool stuff with XenApp workloads, Win 10, multi-session workloads, which will help get better economies of scale, in the cloud. So I think, personally, I think there's a great benefit to turning on Autoscale when you go to the cloud model.
So guys, just a quick time check here. We're consuming the hour rather quickly. It's good stuff. I don't know how much past the hour we can go, but I just want to make sure we kind of get through the rest of the content because it's really good stuff. And the next topic is the one. It's my favorite topic, right? It's the ICA protocol. I mean, it's called Citrix HDX Technologies here, and that's true. But that's really the marketing guys calling it that, right? We all know it's what we can do with the Citrix protocol, which is the thing that makes it the most valuable piece of the Microsoft story, and that is that beautiful protocol that we've had since way back when, 30 years ago, that's continued to be beat on and tweaked. I saw a movie this weekend where they kept tweaking a car until it was fast, extremely fast. And Citrix has lots of what I call scars on their knuckles, getting the ICA protocol, or what we should call the HDX technologies, amazing, and bringing that into the Microsoft Enterprise Virtual Desktop world in Azure is probably the most important thing. So Kevin, I hope there's still too much of your thunder, but take it away from there.
Sure, Andy. And when it comes to even just ICA itself, and I think just what really kind of stresses the capability of the technology is that the protocol itself is really built into just a series of different channels. So it's not just user experience and just the efficiency to deliver that seamless connection and just, have keystrokes and mouse clicks and screen scrapes be transported securely over the wire so that you can kind of centralize your applications. The fact that ICA really is, and this is the secret sauce, it's just built into just a handful of different channels, like a different channel for, ThinWire, which is the screen experience, multimedia. So you can have granular redirections of things like, video with using something like browser content redirection, clipboard, keyboard, drive mappings. Admins are able to, from a security perspective, control all of those tweaks because they're different channels within the overall ICA protocol. And just thinking of just the ability to adapt, like especially as we've kind of continue to invest in like enlightened data transport known as EDT and adaptive transport. So for example, I have a screen where there's a video on one section of the screen, but then just text on another, like the ability for now the protocol to adapt within the screen itself and selectively enable certain types of transport based on what's going to optimally drive the best user experience, I think is really where this protocol shines. And I think that it kind of, again, hits on the theme of like why Citrix, even at the protocol level, is just the granular level of control. I want to throttle printing versus keyboards and mouse clicks versus multimedia. I can control all the bandwidth limits of each of those capabilities because each of those capabilities is a different channel within the overall protocol. And like you said, Andy, I mean, this is like the secret sauce of our virtual app and desktop, and is really one of the biggest reasons why, even back in like the MetaFrame days and just Citrix sitting on like RDSH servers, why, we've really built a strong relationship with Microsoft because they know that our protocol can scale. It can drive a higher end user experience, especially in very challenging network connections from like a remote access perspective.
I mean, think about all those challenges that existed back in the dial-up modem days. Yes, a lot of those don't apply now, but the latency conversations, the bandwidth conversations, which we'll talk about here in a minute with SD-WAN, but a lot of those scenarios in a cloud world might apply just as much as they did back in the day. And having a protocol that the others are just now realizing they really need to take to another level gives Citrix a big leg up for a while on the competition when it comes to adding value to the Microsoft Enterprise Virtual Desktop story, aka WVD. So, Kevin, the next thing you have on here is optimization for Teams, Microsoft Teams. You might want to cover that one and Skype at the same time, or you want to break them up? You tell me.
I could cover them both at the same time because the concept is fairly similar. And I think it makes sense to talk about optimizing Teams by first really talking about how we optimize Skype. We do that today through, what we call like the Skype real-time media, real-time optimization pack. It's a agent that you install on the VDA or your workload within your Azure subscription, and then an agent that gets installed on the end user client. It enables the ability to have more of a point-to-point connection of that multimedia experience from an audio and video perspective between, like, say, myself and Andy versus having to like hairpin into the data center, adding additional latency and potentially compromising performance. Now, how have we built upon that? Again, virtualized world. I want to have a rich multimedia experience. I don't want to have everything exist in my data center. The Teams optimization has made it a lot easier from an admin perspective. Why? Because I just mentioned two different agents. Those agents need to be managed. Those agents need to be deployed. Those agents need to be updated. The Teams optimization pack works in a fairly similar way. But what we've done is we've actually built into the components into the Workspace app and into the VDA. So in order to optimize Teams, you just need that Windows, the current release version of the Workspace app on your Windows client, and then your VDA just needs to be on the current release version. And then once you enable the appropriate policies, you can now have more of that rich multimedia experience and that direct peer-to-peer connection when it comes to like providing that Teams experience. So that's now built into the product. So like the overhead of maintaining that capability is significantly lower, and it still drives, the goal of I want to have an optimized user experience, especially as my team members collaborate using Microsoft technologies.
Bill, I'll give you this one to chime in. Any additional thoughts or comments or questions for Kevin on the ability to remove the hairpinning scenario around real-time collaboration, specifically voice and video as it relates?
Well, I had some experience in my past dealing with phone systems and voice over IP. And when Skype first came out and we started trying to virtualize that without the real-time media engine, it was not the best experience, to be honest with you. I mean, most customers were really just doing it for chat, but once they started adding on the voice and video, it was more of a challenge. But obviously, Citrix took this to heart and built a solution around it, and now it works a whole heck of a lot better than it did then. It's an order of magnitude better. So I'm real pleased to see them bringing this into the Teams world as well. We got a lot of customers that have been asking about it.
Yeah, so to be clear, right, it technically works through the protocol, right, Bill? You can even offload it to a different channel, but the conversations are kludgy because there's a bigger pause in between, and already VoIP already has a little pause to it. So not to give people the wrong idea, on a LAN it works pretty good inside the protocol. But when you start getting in WAN scenarios, latency starts going up, then all of a sudden you have these awkward conversations, and then you throw video into that, and you have a whole nother degree of interaction. So, all right, so let's go to the next one. And I'm going to come back to Pete on this one, but the Citrix SD-WAN optimization and how it plays in this Citrix and Microsoft Enterprise Virtual Desktop story. Kevin?
Definitely. And so when it comes to even just thinking of like the Teams optimization pack, Azure, especially when you get into Office 365, is driving a lot of the overall just communication, like things like authentication, signaling, data collaboration, some of the IMs, all that is going into Azure for some of that usage. Now, where this really comes into play is, especially if you have customers with these large hub and spoke models, you have a big data center, I'm going to use a city in Texas because I live in Texas, a big data center in Houston. And I have all these branches throughout the United States, but all of my internet, like outbound internet traffic has to go through and get funneled through a proxy that happens to be in my Houston data center. For cloud apps like Office 365, Workday, Concur, et cetera, having all of your branches, having that cloud traffic and that collaboration traffic having to go through, your WAN out through Houston, it adds a significant amount of latency and really compromises the experience of that SaaS-based application. So what we do with Citrix SD-WAN is we're a partner of Azure Virtual WAN. So for example, in that branch, I could do internet breakout where I have a SD-WAN appliance, and instead of having to go through my WAN into that Houston data center out through into Azure, I can actually have a breakout of that specific traffic, use the ISP or just the generic internet, or if that's set up within, if that's not set up within the overall, branch office. But like I can actually isolate my Office 365 traffic and have that go directly from that branch into Azure for more of like, just like the Teams, like a point to point between me and Andy. Think of it as more of like a point to point from like a branch to an Azure data center. So thinking of like a web experience, like if you have like an E1 license, for example, this really tailors and optimizes that overall experience, because now it's like much more direct, from that location to Azure, hitting Azure Virtual WAN. And I think for a lot of customers, especially just distribution and thinking about how dispersed some of their just offices can be, being able to kind of get more direct connections for their SaaS apps, that's really where SD-WAN shines.
All right, Mr. Downing. Go ahead.
I agree with everything. And I always tell customers, if you're looking at Azure and just cloud in general, you better be looking at an SD-WAN strategy, because to Kevin's point, it's all about optimizing the user's experience and ensuring that they're going to get the best experience possible, whether they're using SaaS, VDI, combination of the both. And that's really where Citrix SD-WAN shines, especially with the Office 365 integration, the internet breakout at the branch functionality, the direct tie-ins to the REST APIs, and then also taking advantage of the Azure Virtual WAN, which will help speed up getting using the Azure backbone to get to your data center, which then therefore will make it more efficient if you are using Citrix. But the big thing too is the ability to not only look at the protocol, but the packet itself and shape the packet. So a good example of that is the receiver ICA protocol, right? It's not just going to shape ICA, it's also going to shape the streams within Citrix ICA, which is very beneficial. So if you want to emphasize, you were talking about earlier, video over the WAN versus, typing, you can do that with SD-WAN, which is pretty cool if you think about it. So it enhances, again, the user experience. The theme here is user experience.
So guys, I got to admit, when Citrix first got into the WAN optimization business, I was like, well, why would a company like Citrix get into that? And then all of a sudden, this whole cloud thing happened, and link aggregation, WAN optimization, shortest path stuff started showing up within the product. All those years of me questioning it, Citrix knew all along that latencies are our enemy. And no matter how good the ICA protocol is, we have to still fight and keep latency at bay. All right. Next topic on here is session recording. Kevin, this one's near and dear to my heart. I don't think enough people know that you have a DVR in the world of Citrix. I think for a lot of the younger listeners, they won't even know what I mean by DVR. But the ability from a security or from a auditing perspective to be able to go back and look at what people did while they were using the protocol and the product, that works here too. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. And so session recording is something that's included as part of Citrix Cloud Virtual App and Desktop Service entitlements, and it's exactly what you mentioned. I want to audit this specific session. You could limit it to specific sets of groups, like if you have a high security group versus others. But even just building off of what we mentioned previously about HDX having multiple virtual channels, one of the great things about our session recording is we can tag certain events. So, like for example, I am in my session and I'm pulling data into one of my map drives, for example, or being able to actually tag that experience in that data. Like, so for example, hey, we were auditing this person, we need to do session recording. And, they've tried to move data from that virtual desktop, like into an endpoint or like a USB drive or printer, et cetera. Since we have all of those different virtual channels within HDX, we're actually able to tag those. And that product actually being built into Citrix and a Citrix technology, this kind of builds off of some of the further bullets around security analytics. What if I want to have sessions record dynamically? Maybe it's not this use case. It doesn't have audit requirements, but if something fishy is going on, I want to just be able to see what happened. So security analytics, thinking of as Citrix is transformed to the cloud, and we're kind of going through our own refactoring as a company, being more cloud first and cloud enabled, we're making investments in machine learning and the ability to be more proactive. I think, we all mentioned, the point in time with advanced monitoring through Director. Citrix Analytics is really meant to be, machine learning, like a consultant as a service. I want to be more proactive in terms of my environment. So security analytics would really build that risk score around an end user. And the way session recording is built onto that is as my risk score increases, maybe I'm connecting from different areas, I'm accessing apps I don't normally use, I failed authentication from a point in time. You can actually trigger that session recording dynamically, which is a fairly unique advantage of it being built into the overall Citrix platform and being our technology, so that I have a user that, something's fishy going on and I want to record that session specifically. It's maybe not always part of their use case, but I want to have it as part of an extra safety blanket so I can go back and see if I need to review what may have been a security event. It really all holistically maps into the overall solution for multiple different avenues. So.
No, that's great. Hey guys, just a time check. We're running out of time here. I want to hit these next two because they're super important to understand why doing this through a cloud, through a service like Citrix makes more sense now than ever. And that is performance analytics and security analytics. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yep. And we touched security analytics a little bit. So I want to dig into performance analytics because performance analytics is really meant to be again, shifting how you manage the user experience, quantifying it by generating a user experience score. Because, we being the presentation layer, between Citrix ADC, between Virtual App and Desktop Service, between Workspace App, we're capturing a lot of data on the end user experience. And what performance analytics is meant to be is to quantify it. What are different user groups that might have different user experience scores compared to others? And I want to, somewhat aggregate this into one central point of management so that I can identify, risks in my environment from a performance perspective. And I want to be able to address them in a more targeted way. I always see customers, how do we quantify user experience? Every organization may differ. And for us, I think taking our key metrics that are within our product and actually now finally quantifying them to a score for an organization, so that they can now even look at things like what's the price per performance. So kind of wrapping this all together, I have a user experience score of 85, and I just upgraded everyone to compute optimized machines that maybe have more resources, and it only brought my user experience score for my end users from an 85 to an 89. Was that additional investment really worth it to my business if I'm only making an incremental change of user experience? And I'm very excited about this platform as well, just like I mentioned with Autoscale, because I think it really opens up just a ton more insight for our admins and architects that we have within our customer base to really drive meaningful change within the technology.
I use my example all the time about being, on the subway system in one of the cities like New York, having that third party something that's seeing everything that's happening, whether it's from a performance perspective or from a security perspective, adds a whole nother, more advanced even capability to have an insight into whether it's performing and the conversation's going as expected, how it's been going for the sake of the conversation, or how it went versus yesterday or the week before or the year before, and then also the analytics piece around security and knowing that, hey, something doesn't seem right here. Let's let somebody know. So that's
exactly.
So let's go to the last one here that we have on our list, which is third-party identity provider integration. Obviously Microsoft is going to provide the ability to integrate with Microsoft-related technologies like Azure AD or maybe your own AD, some type of federated Microsoft service. But what if we're using somebody else? Let's talk about it, Kevin.
Yeah, so Citrix Workspace has the ability to bring multiple different IDPs to the table. So Azure AD integrates directly. Well, what if you're an Okta customer? Or what if you're a customer that's, again, in hybrid cloud and you're transitioning? You can actually use a Citrix gateway as the ability with, passing through the workspace. So effectively being able to bring anything like ping, a radius-based solution, RSA, VIP, semantic VIP, you can bring that into the overall user experience from an access perspective. So having that flexibility from at just the authentication level, and then being able to address certain challenges like a single sign-on into a Windows-based device, if you're using a SAML-based identity provider like a Ping or Okta through like Citrix Federated authentication services. So we don't want, authentication and, security is critical when it comes to how we approach our products and architect our products. We don't want a security requirement from an end user experience and authentication perspective to create a challenge when it comes to overall adoption of the solution. And like thinking of just hybrid when it comes to cloud, a lot of customers are hybridizing identity and moving down an identity strategy where they want to federate their applications from a SaaS, from eventually a Windows, et cetera, and being able to adapt to that strategy within a customer, even if it's not like say an Azure AD, for example, and ingest that into our overall solution is a critical piece. For us when it comes to even just pushing towards cloud, especially when you get into SaaS applications, for example.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that's a big challenge for a lot of people because they've made that decision and they need to be able to bring that into the mix here, either short term or long term. And they may end up with multiple identity providers that they want to bring in. Hey, Pete, any comments on that or any of the other topics we've covered here towards the second half of our horseshoe?
No, I think the whole integration with different IDPs is going to be critical. One of my favorite things that was enabled in the second half of this year was the ability to use your NetScaler on-prem or I should say Citrix Gateway as an IDP on-prem, because that enables customers to move to Citrix Cloud a little more seamlessly. And then as Citrix brings on more support for third party, it allows them to make consider, hey, do I push to using the Citrix Gateway service as opposed to keeping my Citrix Gateway on-prem? So that excites me as far as, how the whole IDP integration is going to evolve over let's say the next year in 2020. So.
Hey, Bill, how about for you? The second half of the curve we've talked about here, any particular topics that you want to revisit and maybe dig into a little deeper?
Not really deeper. I just kind of as an overall statement, I think that, the choice is clear here. If you're going to be leveraging Windows Virtual Desktop, for anything other than just the basics, you need Citrix. And I think we've demonstrated that by going through all of these various features and various elements that Citrix adds to the story. So I think, this is all good stuff. A lot of it is stuff that that our customers and us have worked with for years. A lot of it's new. We could probably do a podcast on many of these things individually, but I think overall the message is that you really need Citrix, even with Windows Virtual Desktop today.
So I think a lot of people would argue that you don't need Citrix. However, they're probably going to do their research either superficially, or they're going to do their research by actually setting up POCs and pilots. I think in a lot of cases, all the things that have made Citrix special in the Microsoft world all these years, you're ultimately going to find out there's going to be one feature, just one thing is all it takes for you to still need Citrix in this Microsoft world that we're talking about.
Absolutely. You could go back 20 years, 25 years, in the mid 90s when the whole terminal services thing came down and people were talking about, do I need Citrix? And here we are 20 some years later, right?
Yeah, for sure. All right, Kevin. Well, thank you for going through that with us. Anything before we let you go that you'd want to tell the audience here, whether it's about this topic or anything else? Here's your chance.
No. Well, I just want to say thank you for having me. I thought this was a fun experience. I feel, like was mentioned before, I feel like each of these topics could really be its own podcast in itself. And we've really only scratched the surface of, what Citrix can do, especially when it comes to Microsoft. And I kind of end on like a metaphor and how I usually describe it to customers where, think of both solutions as like a car. And Andy maybe hitting at the beginning of the podcast talking about, when we met, 7 years ago and went through that road trip, I still drive the 2010 Hyundai that I had previously. And, I don't have a rear view camera. I don't have Bluetooth. It does get me from A to B. But when it comes to just thinking of having a world-class driving experience, that backup camera from a safety perspective, Bluetooth, having something like the self-driving within, like a highway, for example, to make a road trip a lot smoother. That's kind of really where Citrix differs in terms of layering onto Microsoft is we kind of take that experience and add those capabilities that really make the user experience a lot better. So just think of like the next road trip you're doing, not having Bluetooth, for example.
Well, think about, that's a great example. Would I drive that car of yours from, my house to 200 miles away? Maybe. Would I put my kids or my wife or somebody else in that car? Probably not, right? And so if we don't want our end users to have that 2010 Hyundai experience, then that's where Citrix comes in and rounds out the equation and fixes problems that you may or may not even know you had. And that's another one too, right? So you might have a project today that you can get away with straight up WVD, but what happens when the next variable gets introduced to that equation and now you're going, well, I can't do that. No, we can't do that project, Mr. CIO or Mr. CEO.
Exactly.
All right. Hey, Bill, any parting shots you'd want to add to this conversation?
Not today, Andy.
I do hear Kevin's challenge. We should probably come back and maybe do a podcast on every single one of these with a deeper dive at some point.
Yes.
Speaking of which, Pete Downey, any additional thoughts on this topic?
No, I think getting another hour would have been nice, but I think we should follow up on some of these topics because there's a lot of great details we could cover even further. So I'm excited and thanks for joining, Kevin. So
thanks for having me.
So Pete, you've got a podcast of your own coming out that's more industry than just Citrix focused. Let's give people a teaser on that one.
Yeah, so I'm gonna take, Andy, what you're doing with Bill and take it up a notch to the industry and focus more on topics around the industry. Try to get guests that are more industry focused and talk about some of the trends that we're seeing around end user computing, digital workspace, networking, security, et cetera. So I'm excited to get that started. Probably looking at doing that starting in mid-December into 2020.
That sounds great. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for the time. Appreciate our listeners, and we'll do it again in about a week or so.